The right to offend is not some pesky little part of freedom of speech that we have to put up with. It is the heart and soul and lungs of freedom of speech. It is the coursing lifeblood of human progress. It is the instigator of liberty and modernity and science and understanding. What a laughing stock today's student leaders are, that they can so casually dismiss the right to be offensive without realizing that their lovely, enlightened lives are the gift of individuals who gave offense. Offensiveness is not just something we have to begrudgingly accept. Offensiveness is the motor of human progress.
Now broadcasting from the Right to Offend Media Studios in sunny South Florida, bringing you the latest in politics, current events, art, and pop culture. This is the Whitfield Report Live with Sam Whitfield.
But giving offense is good. In fact, it's essential.
Alrighty, everyone, and welcome to the Monday edition of the Whitfield Report. I am your host, Sam Whitfield, recording here at Right to Offend Media Studios. And joining me for today's episode is someone who I've wanted to have on the podcast for a while now, and also, believe it or not, someone who I've gotten a bunch of requests to have on. Mr. Frank Theodat, who is an author as well, and who is also, I would say, probably the foremost expert that I know of on the history of Pulp. He is the editor at large over at Pulp, Pipe, and Poetry, which you can find over on Substack. And he's just an overall fascinating guy, and I'm honored to have him on. So, Frank, welcome to the Whitfield Report. How are you?
Well, thanks, Sam. I'm doing well. I'm excited to, be a guest. I've known of the Whitfield Report for some time. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So just starting off, what's kind of just your, general background, even like outside of writing and whatnot. Who is Frank Theodat, I guess, is the easiest way to start off.
Yeah, I can summarize that pretty quickly. I grew up in the Boston area. I currently reside in Massachusetts, outside of Boston, with my wife and my son, who's 3 now. And I've always been fascinated and interested in entertainment, first with a long love of movies, television, growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, comic books. I came across novels relatively later in life, probably around college is when I started reading for pleasure, sad it is to admit. But I've always been interested in storytelling. I've always been interested in entertainment. Growing up as an only child, I had developed a very active imagination, something that I think has really served me well as a writer, storyteller. And it's kind of been this well that I've tapped into in terms of, short story writing, which is what I primarily do. I published my first short story collection back in 2023 with another one on the way this summer. And I just love it all. I'm someone who has a bit of an obsessive personality when it comes to all this type of stuff. It's something that I very much frequently, refer to with my own writing, with my own creative work. I would say I'm definitely a writer first. I'm definitely someone who loves all things based on vibe, based on style, based on mood. I've been told, at least, I'm somewhat of a cinematic storyteller. In regards to in terms of a lot of like my short story writing, and I think that just has a lot of appeal for a culture that is so um, that finds itself so steep in visual storytelling. Even though what is coming out of Hollywood now is nothing
Garbage.
compared. Yeah. For you said it. You said it, not me. All the stuff that's coming out of Hollywood and mainstream entertainment is not anywhere near the level of what it was when, not just when we grew up, but generations prior. Uh, it's still the dominant medium, and you see that with people on social media, on YouTube, and what have you. To be called a cinematic writer or a cinematic storyteller really lends back to how I grew up as a kid. Just I loved movies. My parents, I have still vivid memories of my mom glued to the screen on Turner Classic Movies. My father watched all the great westerns, John Wayne, the John Ford films, Gary Cooper, Clint Eastwood, spaghetti westerns, all of it, and from films like The Godfather and Goodfellas and Casino,
Yes.
all the good stuff that's what informs my writing, in a cinematic way. So that lends itself to me in terms of like how I kind of view stories. And I had originally wanted to write for the silver screen. I had Hollywood aspirations growing up, because it didn't occur to me that all the stuff you saw visually started with the written word, or started with a screenplay. And I was very fascinated with that. I was like, well, if it starts there, like that's where I want to be, and
Yeah.
being of modest means, film school was just basically out of the question. So I then discovered that, well, I mean, writing with pen and paper is inexpensive. It's certainly less expensive than trying to find a camera. At least back then it was. So that's something that just kind of stuck with me. And then there was a period in my life where I stopped writing altogether, and it just kind of, it just kind of was locked in the closet of my subconscious. Then around 2020, during the great COVID pandemic, I had all this time because I wasn't commuting into work. I used to commute by train
Uh-huh.
2 hours a day, and I had all this time, and we couldn't go anywhere. So I said, you know what, this writing thing, let's take that a spin. Let's try that again. So as I say, the rest is history, and I've been writing, now on and off with obligations with work and family, but and the magazine, editing that. But yeah, it's definitely a rekindled love affair that I once abandoned, that I'm happy is kind of back in my world.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just it as you were talking, right, it seems like you and I could basically like have the same, childhood, just kind of swap out the names, because I grew up loving, movies
Yeah.
too. And even back when I was a kid, I guess people have always said that that I'm an old soul. And I used to kind of think that that was like a weird, insult. But now I take it as kind of a badge of honor, because like I too love the Clint Eastwood westerns. And then, when I got into middle school, like that was when I watched The Godfather and got into,
Yeah.
you know, mob, kind of crime fiction. And like I was like you, I was never someone who really like liked to read until later on when I was in college. But I will say, like, when I was in high school, that was kind of, I guess, when I initially discovered pulp, novels. Like I remember my grandfather, he's passed on, but I remember
Hmm.
like he had all these like old like pulp, World War II,
Yeah.
novels. And then like also, a lot of people don't know this, but like Playboy used to actually, you know, there was
Yep.
a fiction section as well. And
Hmm.
there's the joke that nobody reads, Playboy for the articles. And,
Right.
I can't say that I read it for the articles, but, once I found out that, that there were, I was like, well, this is kind of interesting. And I discovered, a couple of my favorite authors like James Elroy,
Yes.
from there as well, which led into me, discovering LA Confidential um, and whatnot. So I was never really into like reading, long,
Hmm.
novels when I was like in high school. But I always loved the old pulp novels, and I'd also been writing stories when I was a kid, and then even though I was a writing major in college, I kind of stopped writing fiction for a while just because when you're a writing major in college and you're writing all the time for academic purposes, it kind of it drains you, and so you don't the last thing you want to do after you know uh writing all semester long is sit down at a computer screen and write more. But
For sure.
after I graduated college, I didn't graduate during the pandemic, but like I was in college for a lot of it, and then uh once I graduated, I was kind of in the weird spot of like we had just come out of the pandemic, but like a lot of businesses weren't hiring
Hmm.
for in person. So like I was kind of between freelancing and whatnot, which I still do. I was like, well, now I have time. And I had taken a lot of like film studies classes, and I had written all these I had actually written like a couple manuscripts, and I'm like, well, I don't
Mm.
know that I'm ever going to go into Hollywood, but what if I took these and turned these into like, novels? And what ended up
Yeah.
happening was I turned them into kind of like novellas or,
Yep.
you know, short stories, and that's kind of what I've been doing ever since.
Yeah.
Um, now I actually, I guess I was gonna I was gonna ask like what the history of pulp was, but I just had lunch with a friend, and he asked something very interesting about the pulp genre because we were talking about my work. But I guess one thing that a lot of people, I guess, they don't really know what pulp is. When they think of pulp fiction, all they think of is the movie with that
Yeah.
Quentin Tarantino did, which is
Yep.
fantastic. But you know, it's and it is a representation of the genre, but it's just one aspect. So my friend asked me, well, Sam, what happened to the pulp genre? Why did it quote unquote die out? And I was like, well, that's an interesting question. I don't know the
Yeah.
answer, but I know someone who might not know the answer, but might have a pretty good answer. So,
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on like why the pulp? I don't think the pulp genre died, but like, why do you think the interest decreased in it a bit?
I mean, that's a wonderful, wonderful question, and I think this is definitely to your point, right? You're 100% right. Like most people, I think most mainstream normies, if you will, if you went around saying that you write pulp fiction, the first thing they're probably going to think of, and this is still not even mainstream. Like it's, I think it's just people who are just in the know, like in the entertainment world or film or all that stuff, they're probably going to think Quentin Tarantino is the first
Right.
go ahead. But I think with when Pulp Fiction, the community of Pulp Fiction, you and I are in the same travel in similar circles with the Men's Adventure Discord community, which I think everybody who hasn't done so already, who's a listener, should definitely check it out. But I think with the pulps came out of the dime novels right after the Civil War. So it's these cheap little paperbacks, of this. size that really took the reading public by storm. And there are other countries that still run pulp magazines. I know Germany, for
Yeah.
one, still has a very active pulp community and is still publishing pulps. And in the traditional spots, right? So like, train stations, pharmacies, it's there. It's present. And that's what it was like in this country. In this country, you had editors, Frank Munsey, who is the godfather of the pulps. He was the one who started the pulps out of business necessity, because pulp, the whole word pulp, comes from the cheap paper that it's produced on, and because they could print it so cheaply and they could produce mass quantities of it relatively quickly, that's where the name stuck. To answer your question on how the heck did the pulps died, since the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s are kind of like the heyday golden era, the golden era of the pulps. Right at the 1950 mark, what happened was the beginning of television. Television was starting to become this new craze. People started getting TVs in their home,
Right.
and slowly but surely, less and less, and it's the reading habits of the 1950s are very different from where they are in 2025. But still,
Yeah.
television was the new darling. It was the hot thing on the block. And so many people started getting television, and television shows became a little bit more sophisticated. And throughout the 50s and into the 60s and the 70s, the pulps became, the mass paperbacks, the ones that you see
Yeah.
in secondhand bookshops and thrift stores. You see these little just little show and tell. You see these little books, that still it becomes the new generation of the pulps. It becomes the mass paperbacks. And then slowly but surely, the pulps just die. They go out of style. More and more people, or more and more publishers rather, the small presses end up folding or get absorbed by these larger presses, and then now you have about the big four or the big five
Yeah.
out of New York. And in the 80s, the publishers decide, hey, why don't we, because the pulps are essentially novellas.
Yeah.
They range between 20,000 words and 40,000 words, 50,000 words. And then the publishers decided somewhere at time in the 80s and then the 90s, we could charge more for a larger book. And then you have, all these hardback editions that are coming out. And then you have this request of large novels, 80,000 word, 100,000 word novels that are coming out. And then everything shifts from there. I don't think it was because readers became less interested in pulps. I think what ended up happening is television started becoming soon became the more dominant medium, where everyone started watching television.
Right.
And I think the publishers saw an opportunity to really milk as much money, to squeeze the consumer for every nickel and dime that they had, by demanding larger books to print. And I think because everything, especially in the West, comes at some sort of cost, writers just started writing more padded novels. Not to say that every novel that came out was necessarily padded, but when you start making those adjustments, those economic adjustments, writers, most writers are coin operated. They end up doing making those changes. And then the pulps have now become this kind of relic that older generations who grew up with it now collect them in their pastime for thousands of dollars, and then they trade them in these conferences, Pulp Fest being one of the bigger ones. And then there's guys like us, this next crop, this new generation that hears of the pulps, that's fascinated by the pulps, and is trying to trying to, add to that culture, this new generation of pulp. And I think it's a convoluted answer, it's a long-winded answer, but I think it's multi-prong. You've got
Yeah,
all of these cultural shifts that are happening on the ground level, and then publishing decides that, yeah, we're gonna start making some sweeping changes for the almighty dollar.
it's really interesting that because it's really interesting, kind of the whole evolution of publishing and whatnot, because like I love Tom Clancy and I love
Mhm.
Robert Ludlum. Like out of like the two, big, like, I guess, classic spy novelists, like, they're great. And
Yeah.
I love them, but their books are tomes.
Yes.
Like, I had trouble finishing a lot of them. And I think, one of the things with a lot of novels being padded is, yes, I love descriptive, works, but I feel like one of the things that the pulps were really good at was the pulps were really good at telling a story and getting to the point, which
Hundred
is kind of interesting because as a technical writer and someone who writes content for businesses for a living, one of the things, and I've talked about this on other podcasts, one of the things I was literally kind of trained to do in college was to write quickly and to get to the point, whether I'm
Yeah.
writing ad copy.
Mhm.
So when I started writing fiction myself, more seriously, a lot of these, skills that I had learned for business writing transitioned over to kind of writing fiction. The other interesting thing
Absolutely.
too is I remember when I was writing my first what ended up becoming my first novella, Shadows of Deception. One of my friends, I told him that I was writing a novel, and he said, "Well, I'd love to read it," but he said, "But I don't really have time to, read big
Right.
novels." And I was like, "Well, what if the?" I'm like, "Well, what?" And I didn't tell him that this was kind of my plan, but I asked him, I'm like, "Well, what if the book were like sub 200, pages?"
Yeah.
And he was like, "You can do that in you can do
Mhm.
that in book writing?" And I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, there used to be a genre, and I kind of gave him a rundown of the pulps, and he's
Yeah.
like, "How come nobody told me about this?" It's very fascinating. I don't know about you, but like, one of the stereotypes that kind of drives me crazy is, I mean, yeah, I know you and I are around the same age. Growing up all the time, like around the 2000s and 90s and whatnot, one of the things I always heard from adults and especially teachers is, kids don't like to read anymore. They don't have an attention span. They just like video games.
Right.
And I don't think it's that kids, I don't think it's that like kids and people our age, it's not that we don't like to read. It's that the
Mhm.
idea of like of sitting down and like reading a 500 page
Right.
novel is really time consuming, and a lot of people don't have time for that anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're spot on, and I think that's just I think this is multi-pronged. I think it's funny that you mention, attention spans and everything else, from like back in the 90s, early 2000s, because the pulps, like I said, most of the like there was no word really for the short novel. Everyone, if you ask certain writers especially what constitutes as a novel, if you ask them, they'll most likely say, oh, anything that is 50,000 words or more. For the pulps, most of those novels, they called them short novels before they called them novellas. Most of those short novels ranged anywhere between 20,000 and 40,000. that was considered novel length. And if you look at some of the magazines, they'll say, short story. They'll say novelette. They'll say, short novel. And I think, again, to the point of attention spans, this is why when I wrote my first this is why I write short stories, because they're a wonderful medium that you can tell a full story, a full-fledged story with a satisfying ending in just about 3,000 words, sometimes more, sometimes less. And writing short fiction, I always market it to other people who are saying, "Oh, I don't have time to read." I said, "Well, try short stories."
Yeah.
Short stories as its own genre and as its own medium of storytelling was dominant in the pulps, to the point where folks like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who one of the great American novelists, wrote a letter saying how he was writing short stories to finance his novels. And it's completely switched now. Most people who are getting into the writing game, who want to be writers, who want to make a career out of writers, write with the aspirations of being novelists, not short story writers. And I think a lot of that comes back to the cultural shift between people who are primarily who are familiar with writing, or familiar with the craft of writing, or familiar with reading. They mostly look at it as like these big, huge, hunking books that are 500 pages plus. And to tell someone, today's day and age, that there was a time where you could pick up a book, of a size that you can finish in an evening, is almost unheard of for a lot of people. And I think part of this new pulp renaissance that we're seeing, so many people are getting back to that. They're getting back to the short. They're getting back to shorter stories, not for brevity's sake, but you don't need, more often than not, 100,000 words to tell a cohesive narrative. You just don't.
Right.
And I think now people are starting to see, you talk about people in a fast-paced society that just don't have time to get to, one massive novel, let alone a trilogy or a series. You go back to the publishing, what the big publishers are demanding. But I think part of this resurgence of pulp is because people have been essentially, maybe brainwash is not the right word, but for lack of a better phrase, they have been told that real reading, real writing, real novelists are these, super long stories. And some stories, don't get me wrong, some stories may need 80,000 words or more. I would argue most of them don't. I would argue that you can tell a great story that has a punch, that has a satisfying ending, that's a satisfying experience for the average reader, no more than 50,000 words or 60,000 words.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree. I was told by some by some writers that I really respect, when I first, started publishing the Shadows of Deception, books. I was told, they're like, hey, you've got a great, story here, but this won't sell, because it's so short. And I'm like, well, even on like the indie market, I really asked them, I asked them, why, and they're like, well, because it just doesn't, there's no market really for novellas, anymore. I'm not someone who has a giant ego or anything like that, but I kind of take the Steve Jobs philosophy with something, because I remember reading a story or an article about how back during the 1980s, when Steve Jobs was working on the Apple Macintosh, computers prior to 84, they were, they were DOS based, meaning they didn't have a graphical user interface. A lot of people thought that, uh, you know, graphical user interfaces were unnecessary and that they would be too much. And Steve Jobs famously once said that, the customer doesn't necessarily know what they want until you give it to them. And
100%. 100%.
how does this tie back into Pulps? Well, I don't think I was being arrogant, but I definitely do think that I think that there is a market for Pulp Fiction. I think a lot of people, I know this from firsthand experience, just from my friend group. A lot of people don't even know what Pulp Fiction is. So how would they even know
Yep.
that how would people know that it's not a viable, medium now
Right.
when they're not even, reading it? A lot of, my readers, they do love it, but they don't, they didn't know about it until they encountered, any of my books or any of Luke's books or, anything like that. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think, spot on 100%, because the phrase a customer is not going to know, they don't know what they want until you give it to them, is pretty much like one of the great uh the great value adds of independent publishing, is
yeah,
that you don't have to go through some sort of, you don't have to publish based on what's popular. You don't have to, when you, this is one of the great tragedies that comes from the big publishers, is that they would have you believe, and I think also to the point back to like the economics point of it, they would have you believe that a short book of 20,000 words, 30,000 words is not worth of any value. Only those big hunking tomes are worth, the $20 or more that people are spending. And I think, that was one of the great things about the pulps, is that they could be produced cheaply and they could be charged, a couple, like a dime or a nickel, that you could find in the drugstore, in the bus stop, in the train station, in any avenue that you could sell any sort of at retail. You could sell pulp magazines on those, spinner racks. That's where the comic books came from. The comic
yeah,
books took that philosophy, they took that approach, and you could back then find a comic book anywhere. And
yeah,
to the point where they took comic books out of, the traditional spaces. David V. Stewart wrote a wonderful article on Substack, and has talked about this, about how they took those books, they took comic books out of mainstream places, where people had those foot traffics, and they put them in the comic book store.
yeah.
They siloed that medium, that art form, and and then it became this niche, this niche hobby. It's the same thing with Pulp Fiction. It's the same.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because like I actually grew up like basically I would spend every weekend as a kid in a comic
Hmm.
bookshop. In fact, I live in Florida now, but I grew up in Colorado, and Mile High Comics is, if you're a comic book fan, like that's,
Yeah,
one of the
yeah.
major things is, and like even now, sadly, like I'm curious since you're a movie buff too, like,
Hmm.
how do you feel like, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but I feel like as a comic book fan, I loved the early era of like 2000s and even like earlier like MCU Marvel movies.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I kind of feel like I remember one of the things is a lot of comic book shop owners were really excited about the MCU at first because they're like, oh, well, this will encourage more people to come into the stores and get interested in comics. And granted, that might happen for a few people, but Like I
Yep.
was already into comics before
Yep.
like the Marvel movies were a big thing.
Yeah.
And sadly, it seems like because of corporate greed, uh, like the sad thing about comic book movies is that like they're more interested in the movie part than they are at comic books. And now like a lot of comic book stores are
Yeah.
ironically like struggling,
Yep.
to stay open even because, aside from the loyalists like you and I and who are really interested in comics, most people are just interested in the next, you know, production.
Yeah. I think it's all connected. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think, like I said, like I told you earlier, like I grew up on entertainment. As a kid of the 90s, like I was like raised on television and movies and all that other stuff. It is funny because yeah, you would think that the way Marvel is has been going, or at least was during the that golden age period, the original run up until Endgame, you would think that this would have been like a not a renaissance or resurgent, but a resurgent interest in the comic book medium across mainstream audiences, that people who pay money to go to a Saturday matinee showing of Avengers would go say, "Hey, I'm interested in Iron Man. I'm interested in
Yeah.
Captain America. I'm interested in all these different characters. Where do I begin?" And sadly, yeah, you're right. There's a wonderful comic book store in my neighborhood that I go to, and they do a couple of events that drives foot traffic. But again, it's among this very niche, very passionate community. It's
Yeah.
it I I don't have an answer as to why that doesn't translate. I have speculation, and I can only speculate that part of the reason why it's not translating as well from average moviegoer to becoming a newfound interest in comic book reading. And I think the reason is when you look at the Avengers, Captain America, Spider-Man, Iron Man, all these big characters, it is almost one of the questions that is just a natural question to ask is, where the hell do I begin? If I want to
Yeah.
read Captain America, where do I start? And if you go into an average average comic book store, and you're not timid, you ask the guy or the gal at the front desk, they could probably help you. But it's got to be intimidating.
That
And I think part of like comic books again as a medium, everything goes back to this cultural shift of like long form storytelling. Everything, it happened with television. Television, the golden age of television, everything became down to a series. Mad Men, Breaking Bad, Sopranos, all of these big, huge, long series that replaced the novel for people to go after. It's one of those things where you have to start back at the very beginning if you want to get caught up in all this stuff. And I think that's the similar thing for the average moviegoer. If they were curious, and I'm not saying that there is no example of someone who says, "Oh wow, let me pick up Guardians of the Galaxy because I'd never heard of them before the movie. Let me go pick up a Guardians of the Galaxy comic book." That's one thing. I think it's possible, but I just think that the same with books and novels, the same thing with comic books, is that I've got in the corner of my library a couple of one shots. I've got a couple
yeah.
of standalone comic series that you open the comic book on page one and it ends at the last page, and then you're done, and then you're free to explore other things. And I think that's where some of the friction is for people to transfer from film to comics.
Yeah, I think also it like as you're saying this, I'm also kind of like flashing back to, my childhood too. I remember like being a small kid and going to see the first Spider-Man movie with Tobey
Mm,
Maguire. And I
yeah,
remember
classic.
at the end of that movie, I remember it being like really not disappointed that it was over, but like, darn, I can't wait, I can't wait for the
Yeah,
next one. And then
right.
I'm gonna have to wait for the next 2 to 3 years. But in the meantime, like, my dad took me to, a comic book store. And in the meantime of, waiting, that's when I got into the comics to kind of, fill
Yeah,
that void. And one of the things that kind of, I guess, makes me kind of sad now actually is, um, like I almost miss kind of like the 2 to 3 year, gap
right,
between
right.
superhero movies or just movies in general. My mom and I were talking about this the other day with like, Star Wars. Like when I was a kid, going to see, the prequel, Star Wars movies was like it was a big deal because it only
Yep,
happened, every few years.
yep.
And, it was a special event. And now with all these superhero movies, coming out like sometimes every,
Yeah,
6 months or something, it doesn't feel I mean, it doesn't even
not
feel
special.
special
Yep,
anymore. It's kind of like,
yeah,
okay, this is just
yeah,
the next one. Oh, I'll just wait till this comes out on, streaming or
yeah.
whatnot. There's not that anticipation of, oh, I'd better go to the comic book store you
Yeah,
know, to fill that
yeah.
void.
You're 100% right. Yeah, it loses its magic. It loses the
Yeah.
appeal of because like movies, the one of the great things about movies, and again, this goes before like the whole serialization of storytelling for in terms of film and television, but movies, each movie that came out, whether it was a summer blockbuster or what have you, was itself its own event. It felt like at a time every weekend was its own Oppenheimer or its own Barbie. Like if you remember
Yeah.
Oppenheimer and Barbie when it came out, it was like everyone was talking about it. Even people who weren't big movie buffs as probably you or I, they were talking about it. And I think we've lost so much of that touch on a cultural level. And I think, this is what people were originally talking about with superhero fatigue is that you don't just get a direct sequel anymore. You get a spin-off, you get some sort of side character or B character. They now have their own movie, and that has like splintered off into a couple movies, and there's this whole world. Like I think it's so intimidating for someone who you know is in that minority who may not have seen all of these movies or any of these movies. It's like where the hell does one begin? It becomes its own labyrinth of stuff, and I think to the point of where the pendulum is swinging, I think one of the things that we will be seeing a lot more of is a return to not short form storytelling necessarily, but just like a beginning, a middle, and an end, both in the printed word, both in a visual medium of storytelling. And I think one of the best avenues for that in terms of television is the anthology format. Like the
Yeah.
Twilight Zone. I think that's something that I think is ripe for this day and age to kind of make its original comeback.
I think it's very interesting that you say that. As much as I love the interconnected nature of the Marvel movies, you're absolutely right. It does get overwhelming for the average person. I also think that like that whole interconnected thing, it works really well in print and in comic books, but it doesn't work so well in. It's not that it doesn't ever work,
Hmm.
but they've done it so much in movies and TV, it doesn't translate as well as it does
Right.
in the comic book, medium now.
Yeah, I just think so many people are just kind of like they've beaten a dead horse at this point. I
Yeah.
think if I think if and you know what it's also you have to look at it from a as sad as to say like a big corporate entity of it, right? They're
Yeah.
not gonna they were never planning on stopping with Endgame. even though Endgame would probably have been the best place to like put this thing to rest and invest some of that big box office revenue into other smaller features, like little standalone features that could be their own story.
Yeah.
I think so many people, like my son, for to give you an example, my wife and I, my mother-in-law and my son, we watched Spider-Man, whichever the first Tom Holland Spider-Man movie was, and I don't think I'd seen that
Homecoming.
movie. Yeah, yeah, Homecoming. I think I hadn't seen that film since probably when I first saw it in theaters, and it was okay. Like it's a nice, enjoyable film. There's like
Yeah.
3 or 4 other ones after. It's enjoyable, and he loved it because he's starting to get into that craze of heroes and Spider-Man and all that other stuff. But I remember sitting there in my living room watching it, and I said you mentioned the Tobey Maguire movie. I could probably watch Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man like every now and then. I think there's something, but watching this Marvel film, you know, after the kind of rush feeling of when the original films came out, where you went every summer to see a Marvel film. um, I sat there watching. I was just like, oh, another joke. Oh, another slapstick thing. Oh, another, like, it becomes. It's almost like one of those things. Like, once you see the magic trick, once you know how it's made, once you see how everything kind of unravels and comes together, it almost loses its appeal.
Yeah. The slapstick thing is really like, it was fun at first,
Yeah.
but the thing that really kind of, and I'm not someone who needs everything to be like dark and gritty and super
Same.
realistic, but it is very like jarring. And even Endgame has moments like this where
Yeah.
um like, half the population or whatnot has been decimated because of the Thanos snap
Yes.
and whatnot, and things are looking pretty dire, and yet um because it's Marvel, um like the Hulk is making quips or something, and
Right.
I don't mean like dark humor jokes that like would be fitting for them. Well, I mean like quippy, fun, witty
Yeah.
things where it's like, I'm not really sure that this is the best time for like
Right.
for slap. So it's just like tonally, and I feel like they do that because it's like, well, this is Disney and we have to have levity
Yeah.
even when it's not necessarily appropriate. So
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, my son enjoyed it. My first choice would have been the Tobey Maguire one, but that's kind of gets a little jarring for for someone his age. A little bit more
yeah,
scenes, but I just feel as though superhero films of the early 2000s, there was at least a balance, because what Marvel tends to do, or Disney Marvel, what they tend to do is that they don't make comic book films. They make films with comic book characters. So Winter Soldier is its own, spy thriller. You know, Spider-Man: Homecoming is a coming of age story.
yeah,
Everything is its own genre film, and it sometimes it works, sometimes it I mean, I enjoyed it in its original run, but I guess having watched these films on their own, outside of, like I said, the original rush of like when it's like, oh, I gotta see this Spider-Man film, or oh, we gotta see the new Captain America. When you're out of that timeline, so to speak, and you're
yeah,
in the present, you watch it now, it's like, oh, okay, it's fine. It does its job. It checks, but that's the thing. It's like, you're watching something that was concocted in a lab. You know what I mean? It's kind of like if you're going into a small diner, you're on a trip somewhere, and the diner there's nothing fancy about American diner food. I mean, I love going to like a good old fashioned diner where you go to the counter, you see like a selection where you can get your cigarettes. People are going in to play the lottery maybe, or people are just like it's just you come in. There's no false pretense. You're there for breakfast. You're there for lunch. Whatever the case may be, and you have it. But here, everything here is just everything is everything from a Marvel film. You start to see that it's almost overproduced. It's almost too polished.
Yeah.
There's no charm to it as it would be from like early 2000 superhero films. Not many of them were, were uh I wouldn't say they were just like amazing. Some of them, were pretty much like, okay, not that great. But other than that, it's just not. They're just overproduced. They're just like they're made by committee, and it's a whole different feel, and you feel it. I think.
Yeah, I think definitely with those movies, like I think in the search for over perfection, they've taken away some of the charm, and that's a lot of what happens with film. It's interesting that it's interesting because one of the things that I've done with like a lot of my uh, stories, like my novella series for Shadows of Deception, they're novellas, but they all kind of tie together.
Nice.
So you have the story, but then it connects to the next one. But I've tried my best to write them in a way where you can read each of them like separately. So
Yeah.
it's still its own contained. It is connected, but it is its own contained thing. I have no
Right.
problem with interconnected media, but I
Hmm.
think the big problem with a lot of these things now is they rely on people having seen the previous um
Right.
thing or whatnot.
Right. And I think that's what draws me both as a writer and as a reader to short stories.
Yeah,
Just as a practice, but also just like it's enjoyable. Like I just finished Harlan Ellison's Stalking the Nightmare. He's one of my favorite writers. He writes somewhere between speculative fiction and kind of literary weird fiction. But he's just batshit. He knows how to spin a yarn. He had been doing it for so long. Reading his I have an entire shelf in my library that's dedicated to Harlan Ellison science fiction, fantasy, weird speculative fiction. And I don't think I've cracked cracked like 5% of his body of work. But
yeah,
it doesn't matter because he identified as a short story writer, and I think that's where I kind of get it from, is that
yeah,
he had a love and a devotion to the medium. And I think I kind of share it for other reasons as well. But for me, the short story and writing those stories and reading those stories, there's nothing. It's like going into a diner. Like there, what you're getting into when you walk in. You know that you're going to sit down, you're going to crack open this book, you're going to read a couple of stories, maybe one, maybe 10, maybe 20, whatever. And maybe one will grab you, maybe all of them. But it's really just like it's its own assortment of entertainment. You can get a funny
yeah,
story, you can get a dark story, you can get something lighthearted, you could get something philosophical. It's just a box of surprise when you go in there. I've, to the point you were making about Playboy was pretty much the an education for a lot of writers, similar to how the pulps were for people like Max Brand, Frank Gruber, H. Bedford Jones, Agatha Christie, who were writing the pulps. Playboy was really in its heyday quite the well-known bastion of short story writing.
Yeah.
You know, I've got two collections of the Playboy book of horror stories or the Playboy book of science fiction stories. There was, Ray Bradbury was in Playboy. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's one of those things where, you know, it was a respected medium. It was a respected genre of writing. So it's something that I don't think I'll ever abandon now, but I think everything that we've been talking about, Marvel comic books, this whole long form storytelling, serialized storytelling, I think it's great when it's great. You know what I mean? I would never say one is better than the other. I think it's great for when you want it, when you want to spend time with the characters, when you want to spend time in that world. But I think for me, on average, and I think for a lot of people on average, they want to be they want their, not to equate it to fast food, but they just want their fill. You know what I mean? They want to
Right.
sit down with a book and they want it to be good. They want it to be of quality. They want it to pack that emotional punch. And they want to be done and they want to move on because that's another thing. We are living in an age where it's the best time to read the great books, all the previous books that were published, generations. It's a great time to listen to all the great music of generations before. It's a great time to, watch the movies of the 60s and the 50s and the 40s and all that stuff. You know, it's a great time to play video games that were in its heyday and that were great and will last and have that impact. I think most consumers now, it's a plethora of stuff. It's so overwhelming to find something that where to begin on what you want to spend your time with. And time is such a limited resource now that I think people just want to go in and out and explore something else.
Yeah. I think that's all true. Not to jump too abruptly, but kind of, connecting. You've read a few, different works, short story collections, whatnot. What is your general, do you have a general, I guess, what is your writing process? Do you have a generally set schedule or, um, how do you know what you're going to write? Do you have like a set plan or does it just kind of happen or a bit of
Yeah.
both for you?
Yeah, my process now is so different from when I first started. When I started writing, seriously writing and seriously studying uh writing fiction and and not just starting with short stories, but staying with short stories. One of the things that always irks me as a writer is how short stories are spoken to with other writers. Like I said earlier, most writers who have the aspiration to write wish to be novelists. It's very rare that you meet a writer, whether in the circles that we travel in or elsewhere, where they say, "Oh, I'm a writer and I write primarily short stories." Most of them will eventually graduate to novels because short stories are seen as a kind of training wheels, kind of like the floaties for
Yeah,
for writers. They say, "Oh, and they say, write a couple of short stories, then go to a novella or then a novel or whatever." But for me, it was a medium that I loved. So my old process would be staying up late. Like, as soon as I was done with work, as soon as this was before my son was born and before I had a family,
right.
before everything, I would just stay up late and just, read 1, 2 short stories a night and then start writing. I don't write with an outline. And this is part of my
Me
own
either.
lesson. Yeah, this is my own lesson with the pulps, because we were talking earlier about, how economical these writers were. It was just kind of like, come on, let's go. Like, get to the point, get to the story. And I think that comes from the fact that they were writing for a penny a word. There was a wonderful demand for short stories and short novels and everything. And many of these writers wrote under several names. So if you look closely, you could say take someone like Frederick Faust, who wrote primarily under Max Brand. He would write, in a variation of 5, 10 different words, or 5 or 10 different names, all writing. He could write up to 20,000 words a day easily. And he was feeding those magazines. Many of the magazines he filled himself under different names. So I
Yeah.
think that's for me where that comes from, is that, I don't want to spend time outlining. I think to me, just to be perfectly candid, I think outlining, especially if you're outlining a short story, is a complete waste of time. Because for me, and I know this from experience because this is how I used to write. I used to spend days, weeks on an outline. And then by the time I was finished with the outline, and I don't know if this has ever occurred to you, by the time I was finished with the outline, it's like, well, I know how this story ends. Why the hell am I going to write it?
Oh, it happens to me too. Or it used to happen a lot to me, especially like in high school and in college, where I was forced, to outline everything. And I mean, I hate to be vulgar, but like I'll just go out and say I was forced to outline so much that I wound up fucking hating it, like with a passion. And so, ironically, like a lot of the success that I've found has been, for me personally at least, saying basically fuck the rules. And I'm not even
Exactly.
saying that like to
Exactly.
be like an edge lord or anything like that, but um like my first like short what ended up becoming my short story collection, Blood Ties, for the mob, wasn't anything that I even like really, like planned or outlined. It was just like I had this idea for like a short I had this idea for a short story, and it just kind of uh
Takes a
came out
life of its own.
came out of me. I wrote it in an afternoon. I wrote it in like literally over 2 days, not really even thinking about it. And of course, I went back and like edited and refined a little bit
Mhm.
after. That came. So I wrote like the first short story, and then I kept writing them because I was really like in depth with these characters. And it just kind of, before I know it, like I had a small collection, and I gave it to my mom for Christmas. And my mom is not someone who, uh, like, she's very supportive of my work, but she's not someone who is going to say, "Oh, sweetie, this is just, the greatest,"
Right.
because,
Right.
you
She's going to tell
know,
you how it is. Yeah.
yeah. And she told me, she's like, "Wow, this is the best thing that you've written so far." In
Yeah.
fact, like, she's jonesing for volume 2 now, which I'm working on. But it kind of
Yeah.
goes to show how, like, at least for me, some of my best work has just been stuff that, like, some of it I've written in, like, an afternoon or 2 to 3 days.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly how I wrote. Like in 2020 when I started, I mean my first my first short story that I, said I was going to write took me probably 6 months, and I stopped in between. The mistake I made early on, I would stop in between and I would revise and rewrite the whole thing, and I said this is just a terrible process. And then to the point where I discovered not just the pulps, but I also discovered the concept of writing into the dark, which is what you and I are talking about here, that was coined by a contemporary writer, a contemporary pulp writer, Dean Wesley Smith. Uh, I was kind of like drinking that Kool-Aid, and I didn't realize that this was an old form of writing that has existed, that existed back in the pulps. Because if you think about it, if you're a pulp writer and you're getting the demand from an editor to write let's say a 3,000 word short story, and then you have another editor who says, hey, we need a 10,000 word story, and then you have another editor that says, hey, we need a short novel of 30,000 words, and you have all these demands, and you have tight deadlines, tight turnarounds because they're publishing rapidly, and you have a family to feed, especially if you're working during the Great Depression and you have, the rent's due and you have all these deadlines, all these looming things. And the number one thing, you have a manual typewriter. You have an Olympia SM4, you have a Smith Corona typewriter. If you really think about it, how likely would you say that a writer who has probably 5 or 6, 7 assignments, like I'm talking like a Frederick Faust or Frank Gruber or H. Bedford
Right.
Jones, who many of them had, several typewriters going at the same time. How likely do you think those people are actually going to say, well, I finished my first assignment. Now I have to go back and I have to rewrite this word. I have to use this. Like, that's not what's happening, or that's not what happened. That's just, there's along the line, there came this mythology about writing, that it has to be a slow, painful process, that you have to suffer for your words, you have to bleed on the page, like stupid stuff like this. That when you read some of these old books and you read these biographies and you learn about these writers, they weren't doing any of that garbage. They were basically banging the keys all night. Frank Gruber, how he broke into the pulps, and he talked about it. He wrote a story, he submitted it to an editor. The editor says, hey, we're not going to accept this story, but I have the need for a Western. Have you ever written a Western? And he said something like, oh, yeah, sure. I don't think he ever did. And he went to the nearest newsstand, or the nearest spinner rack, bought a couple Western magazines, went home to his apartment, read it from cover to cover, studied everything that he could, and all night. And he details it in the book, if you can find it. It's a great book, The Pulp, Jungle, by Frank Gruber. He details it in painful detail, like by the hour, of how he wrote this story. And he spends all night writing it, doesn't rewrite a word of it, goes to the editor the next morning, hasn't slept, hands in the manuscript, doesn't hear back for a day or two. His phone rings and they say, hey, we'll accept it. You can come by and pick up your check. And that's how he broke in. And that is a tradition, what I have coined as the pulp work ethic, of just get it done, get it on the page. You can, if you want to rewrite it, which I don't recommend, you can, but I think some of my best writing, and this is not my own thought, similar to what you've said, the best stories I have written, according to readers, according to people who enjoy my work, according to, other budding writers, the best stories I have written are the stories that I have absolutely no idea where it's going to end, and are typically the stories that I write the fastest.
Yeah.
I have written stories in an afternoon. I've written stories
Same.
in less than 2 hours. And those are the stories that people either remember, or they say, wow, this is like fantastic. This is like, wait. And I most of the time, unless they're one of my peers, I don't tell them that I don't really outline. But I just, my whole thing is that whenever a writer tells me that they're outlining a novel or a novella or what have you, and then they're going to go back to write it, I don't even pick those fights. I just say, hey, I can't wait to read it. Or, I try to be supportive, because every writer is different. But for me, the best stories are the ones that are, are written in a sweat, that are written with a fiery passion, where I'm punching the keys and I hit the end, and it's an out of body experience. I can't articulate for you what that experience is like. And I know I'm doing that when it becomes almost, this is going to sound counterintuitive, but almost when it sounds boring, almost when it comes off as boring. And what I mean by that is, usually the beginnings are harder for me. I will typically start with a character. I will put him in a setting, and I'll give him a problem. And 9 times out of 10, the original problem is not, the problem of the story, but I'll just start that way. And then it's kind of, you kind of force yourself, it's kind of like what Louis L'Amour said, you're turning on the water and you're waiting for the water to warm up. It's the warm up phase in the writing. So you sit down and you're writing the story, and then suddenly something clicks and you're like, okay, I know where I'm going. And then there's a point in the story where it's like, oh, where am I going? And then you kind of meander and you meander, and then you keep writing. And then when you're in constant flow, you're not even thinking about the words. They're just pouring out of you. But
Yeah.
it's not a feeling of like, it's not a feeling of elation or joy, really. It's just like, it's almost, I would equate it to like almost writing an email, which I know sounds really boring
No, no,
and
no.
mechanical, but you know what I
I
mean? Like,
yeah.
yeah, it's
So
almost like you're writing an email, you're not thinking about the words, and then you find yourself at the end, it's like, oh, the story ended like 2 paragraphs ago, and then you're like, and you're done. And then you give it off to someone and they're amazed at like, whoa, like, where did you come up with this idea? It's like having the foggiest. It just comes out. It just
yeah.
comes out.
No, no, you're right. So I mean, so my writing process is kind of much the same way. I just kind of spitball into the dark. And for me in particular, um, because I have cerebral palsy and some physical disabilities, it's hard for me to type. So one of the things that I do is I dictate a lot of my
Mm,
stuff, and I've been dictating using well, now it's just built into your MacBook, or PCs have them too, which is great. But like I used to use uh you know programs like Dragon Speak
yeah.
to dictate stuff, back before like a lot of people were dictating stuff. So I'm literally speaking my story into uh you know literally like narrating my story
Yeah.
almost. And the way I write things is um present tense. And so what I'll do is I'll write my short stories in chapters, kind of almost. Even
Mhm.
though they're short stories, I still kind of write them chapter wise, and I'll just kind of spitball. And one of the things I've done more recently is and I've gotten a lot of flack for this, but like I don't really, at this point, I don't really care because it's still my original work. But I do use ChatGPT as like an aid because I mean it knows my right. I've used ChatGPT enough to where like um it knows my style and it knows my
Mhm.
character bank, rather than having like piles and piles of notes to like keep track of everything.
Yeah.
Um, I just use as like as kind of like an app, as kind of like a repository. So
Mhm.
all it does is pretty much all it does is basically polish what I've written,
Yeah,
but
it cleans it up.
everything
Yeah.
is just my original it's my original take. The one thing that really uh kind of baffles me is a lot of these people who are very pro AI for like writing emails and nonfiction uses and whatnot
Yeah.
are also like, but you can't use it for fiction because that somehow
Mhm.
destroys like, you know, that destroys like the creative process. And I'm kind of like,
Mhm.
well, hold on.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I definitely think that some people can be over reliant on AI. And I think
Yeah.
if you let it, if you don't have any idea of like what you're doing
Right.
and whatnot, I think people can abuse it. But the way I see AI is it's just a tool like everything else. And
Right.
if you're
Right.
going to criticize me for, using AI, you might as well also criticize me for using dictation or for someone else for using spell check.
Yeah,
So,
I think one of the great uses of AI for writing is research.
yes.
And I say this because I'm currently in the works for, or I'm currently working on a novella, or a series of novellas. Well, let me back up. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But a novella based in the golden age of pirates in the Caribbean. So one of the things that I'm working on is a former a fugitive slave of the island of Hispaniola who works his way to becoming a pirate captain. And I don't know about you, Sam, but I've never sailed the high seas. I've never carried a cutlass. I've never known what it's like to to live, as a pirate in fighting and fighting off Her Majesty's Navy. So I think Chat GPT or any AI platform is great for producing a list, and especially Grok has been very good. I've found to
Yeah.
just to pull from the internet, all of these sources, all of these blog posts, all of these, wonderful resources, and it will actually tailor for me, like, what the day in the life was on a pirate ship, to down to the details of what type of weaponry, certain vernacular and all that other stuff. And I think that's a great use of AI, because if it wasn't for that, I'd probably be spending, weeks, if not months, in a library trying to cobble up and try to read through these books. And for me, the fun part of writing is the actual writing.
Yeah.
I don't want to lock myself in a room, 6 weeks to a year, 6 weeks to a month, or 6 months to finding all the research details when I can just,
Even
have it spit out for me in a matter of seconds.
yeah, well that's another thing too, is like it's really helped me with research too, because one of the things is it is so much easier to type something into ChatGPT to ask the question like, okay, what type of handgun was used by the Navy
Yeah.
SEALs in the
Yep.
1980s, or just as like an example question. It's a lot easier to just ask that question
Right.
to ChatGPT or to Grok rather
Hmm.
than type that same question into Google and then have to
Right.
scour through links to, and I'm not one to shy away from research, but the one thing that I have found is I'll go down rabbit holes of just like doing research rather than actually
Hmm.
writing. So to your point,
It's a time suck. Yeah.
one thing that I'll do is I'll have one chat with like my writing, um, with like my writing stuff, and then I'll do research and I'll be like, okay, insert that into this story then, and it
Hmm.
will it will revise the draft so that
Hmm.
it's incorporated. So
Yeah, I mean, I think to the point that you mentioned about Google, I think, I mean, I don't think, and this is something that has been said before, AI has pretty much replaced most of these search engines.
yeah,
Uh, it's just better optimized for a search engine, because, like I said, with Grok, it will actually pull some of these blogs that are deeply, deeply, deeply buried in pages of Google pages, and it will pull that up to the surface. Think of blogs from, like, the early 2000s, that just don't seem to, that don't even make the first 10 pages of Google. Like, it will pull through all that stuff. If there was a blog post that was dedicated to, you know pirate weaponry, for instance, that's just buried in there, like, it will pull all of that stuff out. So yeah, I think I don't use AI for any of the actual writing, but I do use it for research, and it's been such a time saver rather than spending days and weeks to, not write. I can
yeah,
pull up, specific, ship models. I can pick up, all sorts of stuff and happily use that, and it speeds up the process. I think it's great. Excuse me. I think it's great for that type of stuff, because, especially if I want to write some, one of the things I would love to write is kind of a motorsport pulp story, something into the 60s or the 50s, where, during that era. And I think ChatGPT or AI is great for pulling all the necessary information to give your story enough color and enough depth, to bring down the reader into that story.
yeah. One thing I'm curious too, since you're a pulp guy, so like I write pulp, but a lot of my stuff is set in the It's actually set like in the modern age, but it's written kind of like I guess the best example I can think of is something like Batman the animated series or
Mm,
Blade Runner,
yep.
where the aesthetics is kind of like the 1940s,
Yep.
but you could almost believe that it's like that it's set in present day or something like that.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
the the timeline is kind of ambiguous, and I find that like one of the oddest things I've kind of found in pulp is there's this notion that because it was like written in the 50s and 60s,
Mhm.
that it can only exist, the stories have to exist in that time period, whereas so I guess like I'm more of like a neo pulp um writer, and I've actually
Mhm.
gotten like pushback from some people for setting my stories contemporary.
Yeah.
um what's your kind of whole take on, I guess, neo pulp, or kind of just the pulp? Are there any like hard and fast rules that you feel you have to follow for pulp?
I I am gonna defer to H. Bedford Jones, who is a Canadian-born pulp writer, a Canadian-born American pulp writer, who is known as the King of the Pulps, who wrote millions of words, not just a year, but throughout his career, um, and who wrote everything from high adventure, mystery, crime, the great pulps of the 20s and 30s. When it comes to writing, there are no rules. So I think for what is that? So albeit a little bit facetious of a short answer, but I think for anyone who says they want to write pulp or that they're writing pulp and they're writing in a contemporary setting, I think for me the best way to kind of articulate it is that pulp to me is old-fashioned storytelling. Pulp is a vibe. Pulp is
Yeah,
a mood. Pulp is a it can be an aesthetic. You can go to the 20s and 30s and 40s and capture that aesthetic. You can go for the Indiana Jones high adventure. You could go for something like that. You could go for the Buck Rogers aesthetic of pulp. But I think ultimately what pulp is, and I think what this new generation and this new resurgence of pulp is that it's a return to old-fashioned storytelling. Story is king, man. It has been and it always will be. That is something that the powers that be of Hollywood, that is something that the powers that be for comics, that is something the powers that be for modern entertainment have let it slip through their fingers, whether intentionally or not. And I have a sneaking suspicion it's not all unintentional. The whole movement, the whole pulp fiction movement, the whole pulp revival, the whole resurgence, it's about getting back to old fashioned storytelling, man. That's all it is. It's men being men, it's women being women. It's good versus evil. It's tragedies. I think crime, you mentioned crime fiction. I think things like The Godfather, I think things like Goodfellas and Casino. Those are just Greek tragedies
oh yeah,
set set in mobsters. That's what it is. It's Shakespearean. You know what I mean? It's I would love to do a Hamlet set in kind of like a crime family. I would love to do instead of The Godfather, it's like what if Michael Corleone, his plunge into the world in the underworld is his entire family is slaughtered. Like what if they killed his father and his sister and his brothers, and now he has to go out and plunge for vengeance, and it's wonderful. And I think those primal uh characteristics, those heartfelt, passionate stories. That's what pulp is, man. You can
yeah,
set you could do another Indiana Jones version and call that pulp based on aesthetics, but if you even ripped out some of the aesthetics of Indiana Jones, the heart of the matter, that's what Pulp is. That's what it really becomes, what it comes down to. It's vibe, it's mood. That's what it is.
I'll have to send you a copy. I don't know if you've picked up my short story collection of Blood Ties at all,
Mm-mm.
but that's essentially what I've done as far as like the crime fiction
Yeah.
genre.
Yeah.
Blood
Send it my
Ties,
way. Yeah, send it my way. I'd love that stuff.
yeah, I'll give you an EPUB to read. Also,
Mm.
the audiobook just finished, so once that came out, I'll send that to you as
Nice.
well. But the concept of Blood Ties basically that I took is what if and it's with original characters, but I always took the approach of, well, what if Michael Corleone actually became like a cop, right? And
Mm.
rather than just being a corrupt cop, he's actually an honest cop. But
Mm-hmm.
his entire family is in the mob, so there's that, there's
Mm-hmm.
that dynamic. And I don't know about you, but like I'm a huge fan of the movie Heat. That's
Yes.
probably my
Yes.
favorite Michael Mann film.
I was just talking to my wife and a couple of people about Heat because Val Kilmer passed away recently. So
Yes.
I just that's definitely back on my radar now.
Oh yeah.
But yeah,
I guess we should say, since we're recording this on Friday and this will air on, Monday, but yeah, I mean, I guess we might as well take the time to say, R.I.P. Val Kilmer.
hmm
His performance, well, a lot of people mention Doc Holliday and whatnot, and The Doors, and which is fantastic. But he brought a lot of depth to the character of Chris from Heat, and I think a lot of people overlook. Interesting enough, one of my favorite scenes, and I think it's everyone's, is the diner scene.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, iconic.
between Pacino's character and you know and De
De Niro.
Niro.
Yeah.
One of the things is, I don't know if you've had a chance to read Heat 2, the novel, but
No, no.
one of the things that, I mean, I won't give away too many spoilers, but one of the things that was in the original Heat script that Michael Mann put into Heat 2, the book, is the fact that Al Pacino's character, he really likes De Niro's character.
Mm.
He's kind of like internally thinking, and he's like, it's a shame that this guy is a criminal because we could be friends, right?
Yeah,
So
you do see a little bit of that undertone in that in what ends up in the diner scene for the film. So I could see that. I
yeah.
could definitely see that.
So one of the things with Blood Ties that I've done is, is one brother is a cop and the other is in the mob. And
Mhm.
there's that moral tension because the cop, even though he was born into the mob, he's trying his best to be on the straight and narrow.
Yeah.
But he still loves his brother and he still loves his family. So there's a lot of tension that I've been playing with. And again, that's something that I didn't think about that like for an entire, it didn't take me a year to write. That just kind of came
Yeah.
out of me. And I think it's very weird kind of that there's this whole mentality that you have to spend like a year and a half to 2 years
Yeah.
slaving away.
Yeah. I mean, I to that point, one of the things that I've taken on in my projects in the Variety magazine that I'm the editor and the co-founder or founding partner for, Pulp, Pipe, and Poetry, is a series called Ink and Grit, which started last summer. And Ink and Grit is basically, I haven't come out and said this publicly, but it's basically a giant middle finger to all the MFA programs that have you, slogging through and just really like killing the love of writing. for all these aspirants and all these people who want to write. And I'm sure people have had lovely careers thanks to their MFAs and MFA programs, but everyone that I know that has studied, that has had an MFA or has gone through an MFA program for writing, has basically said that the ones who have survived and who are writing had to unlearn all of the techniques and the learnings and the tools and all the stuff that they had to slog through those 2-4 year programs.
Right.
And I think Ink and Grit is kind of just like the slap in the face to get people back to a time of this long lost tradition of the pulp work ethic, where writers, like the ones I mentioned before, they just wrote, man. They didn't have time to think, heads or tails of anything. Most of these people, were writing in dilapidated conditions of, just like, they may not have heat in their apartment, or they may not have housing if they don't get the story submitted on time to get that paycheck. And I think so much of that resonated and birthed a generation of writers who were really the workman writer. They were the writers that, they treated it like a blue collar job. It's like the construction worker who's working on site. It's the plumber who is working in a person's home. It's the laborer that's, lugging junk. It's all those things that it's just like, you just got to get the job done. And that's what it is. And that's how they treated it. And Ink and Grit serves that function to show other writers. And I know I've had wonderful messages and letters from people who have read that series, Ink and Grit, on the magazine, on Substack, and they have told me it is because of that series, it is because of the article, The Pulp Work Ethic, it is because of, Frank Gruber or H. Bedford Jones reading about these men. It is because of that. That's what compelled me to write a short story that evening. It's like, that's like Nathaniel Hummel has said that to me. And that's what that to me right there is like, if I could have that framed, that message framed, I would, because that's the ultimate goal of Ink and Grit, is to show people that it is just a job of work. That's all it is. It's a few hours in an evening, or it's a few hours over a span of a couple weeks for you to write your story. You and I know, and it's not just because we're writers, but it's because we love storytelling. It's because we love stories, and we have this in the back of our mind, since we were kids, from movies and television, comic books, novels, what have you. Story is everywhere. It's part of the human condition. It's part of what makes us human, and it's in with us. And there's a great quote. I don't have it now with me, but basically H. Bedford Jones says, mankind, being fashioned in the image of God, wants to create. When you're fashioned by the ultimate creator, you have the desire to create. And sometimes it's not always with fiction or storytelling. Sometimes it's other practices or other hobbies or creative pursuits, but it's in our blood. It's in our DNA. That's what makes us human. It's the love of story. It's the sharing of story. And, that's what Ink and Grit is supposed to be. It's supposed to get people who are willing to listen, who are willing to try, who are willing to trust themselves, to wake up and write the story that they want to write, without any false pretense that they have to go to some sort of, Ivy League or some sort of big overpriced program in order to get permission to write the story that they want to write.
Even to read, like, there are thousands of books on, like, writing. And granted, some of them can be helpful, but, like, a lot of these so-called, like, writers' workshop experts, or people who do, like, online courses on writing, they may be good at the craft, but then you look and it's like, well, how many novels have they actually sold? A lot of them.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some that are, that have been very successful. A lot of the ones I've read, they claim to be, they claim to be experts and these in really they haven't written or sold any more or any less than we have.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think ultimately, just kind of write from your gut. That's one thing that James Elroy, who I mentioned earlier, he says is just write from, the gut. He's a high school dropout, and now he's like one of the most prolific,
Yeah.
novelists of our, time.
Yeah, I think if I were to uh give, parting words of wisdom or anything to give people, any aspirant any advice, and I'm not in the business of giving advice, but if I were, gun to my head, tell people, if you want to write how to write, I basically tell them, number one, stay away from anyone who is selling you some sort of course or any sort of program to write. Like if you're gonna pay to learn from someone, they have to have a steady oeuvre of work. And when I say a something of a body of work, I'm talking, I would not personally, the only writers that I listen to are the ones who have novels somewhere north of 100. English novels north of 100. That's
Yeah,
not to say that, you can't learn something from writers that, publish anything less than 100, but that's my own personal benchmark. If you have 100 published novels or books or whatever out in paper or ebook or whatever, I'm not paying a dime to to listen to anyone other than that. And I think the best way for people to write, uh the standard advice is, read a lot, write a lot. That's the Stephen King advice. But I think ultimately, uh there is a list of business rules from Robert Heinlein, author of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, um, Starship Troopers, a lot of
yeah,
classic science fiction. The five little rules of writing is, number one, you must write. Number two, you must finish. Number three, you must not rewrite unless to editorial order. Number four, you must put it out on the market. Number five, you must leave it on the market. If you can do that, and I will also say, to echo my personal writing mentor through his words alone, Ray Bradbury, write a story a week, or just write and finish something in a week. And if that's a short story, if that's a novella, whatever the case may be, but I think just like the practice of that and the repetition of that and finishing something, that will propel you forward. But again, if you want to write novels, then start with novels. The execution, the focus on practice, the focus on finishing and not rewriting, but trusting your instinct. I think that's the best advice to give.
I fully agree. I mean, I also think I think now too, in this age of technology and social media and whatnot, I think, and this is one thing that the men's adventure fiction community does really well. There, and even places outside of the men's adventure fiction, one of the things that is really good about the indie author space is there's no reason not to network with people.
Mm-hmm.
One of
Mm-hmm.
the things I love about this, this podcast, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn here, but like I've learned a lot about writing just from interviewing like several other guests. Like one of the
Mm-hmm.
things is, I know you know who Zach James is.
I do.
He's someone who he has 3 projects going on at once. He doesn't
Mm-hmm.
write them all at once, but he has said to me on this very show that he has multiple projects because he gets bored very
Yes.
easily. Well, guess what? So do I.
Yep.
One of the things I think is, and I don't want to meander on too long. One of the other things that kind of drives me crazy is the idea that, well, once you're starting on this project, especially with novels, is you have to you have to finish the project like right away And
Yeah.
if you've got I think one of the biggest misconceptions is, well, if you hit writer's block, you just gotta keep writing and
Hmm.
somehow push past it. And even if you're not sure how, just write the same sentence over and over again. And
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah,
like, well,
yeah.
that's, if you're hitting a wall, you can't get over the wall just by, just by pushing through it. Sometimes it's good to take a step back.
Yeah.
Some of my best moments have been like, you know, I'll take a break from one thing, write another thing, and then all of a sudden I'll get inspiration for the other thing that I was having trouble with, and then I'll go
Right.
back and write it. So just things like that, I think, have been very helpful. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's definitely something that I think a lot of people can sympathize with, and I'm no exception. Very much to you and Zach. Like I get bored very easily, which is why short stories again are just like my preferred medium, because I can bang out a short story of, sometimes between 1,000 words and 3,000 words in an evening, or sometimes if I have an itch that I need to scratch, I'll write a micro story of 100 words. Like
yeah.
try to write something in 100 words, and sometimes that satisfies the need. Something that I do, and this is kind of a tactic that I personally use if I am stuck in a manuscript. I had mentioned before that sometimes, the beginnings are sometimes the hardest part for me, because it's just the warm up phase, and I'm just like, I've got my character, I've got my setting, I'm building out
Right.
that world slowly, and sometimes I'll, once I hit my stride, I hit it. But then sometimes, especially if there's like a change in scene or an introduction to a new element, I start to lose steam. So what I've done that has been helpful is that I will just literally write whatever I think should happen, and more often than not, I kind of meander. I may type that, like an offhand thing, like I don't know, he went to get gas at the gas station. Something boring, something mundane, and I'm just like putting everything on paper, and then suddenly I get back into the swing of things, like, oh, I know where I'm going. And then what I'll do is that everything that happened before, I delete. I don't even think twice about it. That's another thing that when you're writing short form as well, I don't believe that every word is precious. I'm an economical writer. I think every word should serve the purpose of story. But if it's one of those kind of like meandering techniques that I'm doing, where I'm just like, he's off in the distance in this kind of side quest, um and then I'm like, ooh, now I know where I'm going, and then I get back to the main event. If what I've just spent, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever, does not serve the story, I wipe it clean like it never happened.
Yeah, it what in kind of to your point, one of the things I've done with like, my note with my novella series for Shadows of Deception is, like I said, the stories interconnect with each other. If you read if you read all of the novellas together, yes, you're going to actually get like a full and complete novel. But what I sometimes do is I'll finish one novella. I'll just sometimes know when that specific story is done, even if it ends on a cliffhanger. I'll be just like, okay, this story is done, and then I'll just let the next story like start to kind of uh you know matriculate in my brain, and then I'll write the next one. That's
Right.
why I sometimes publish like 3 novellas a year at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah,
So
no, I think it's a good tactic. Like I said, I get bored very easily, so like that's just one tactic. But yeah, I sometimes will start a whole new story altogether just to like get words out of me, or get, whatever uh story I need to get on the page. The worst is when you're in the middle of writing something and then a whole new idea pops up, and then you're like,
well,
"Oh,
yeah.
I'm more excited about that idea than I am with this one."
Yeah, well, the other thing too is like the other thing that's kind of been surprising is like I'll introduce side characters, right, in my story, and then oftentimes like in the case of Night of the Vigilante, uh, people were more interested in my side character than they were
Yeah.
for the main character. So I actually, for the fans of Shadows of Deception, and Jake Widmer being one of them, I actually wrote, Night of the Vigilante as a, as a spin-off, not expecting it to really, go anywhere. And, everyone's like, this is the best thing that you've done. And I think that's the other thing is, once the audience know, I don't write generally for the audience. I write for myself, but your reading audience, especially in the indie, genre, once they kind of know, they'll know what they want. They'll know what they want.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah. No, that's true. Yeah, I think it's important for every writer to write for himself or herself. I think that's how you, because what I've noticed with writing, and my career as a writer has been very, very short by comparison for most of the
same.
most of the people that I idolize and want to emulate. But it's like, again, my favorite writer, Harlan Ellison, said, "The trick is not becoming a writer. Anyone can become a writer. The trick is staying a writer." And I think that's true. I think it can be a slog. It can be very lonely. It can be, frustrating. It can be exciting. It can be a whole well of emotions. But I think ultimately, if you want to stay in this game, and it is a game, writing is not, to me anyway, it's not one that you should take yourself too seriously on. Uh, Especially if you're a pulp writer, because the business of a pulp writer is to entertain readers, you being your first reader. So hopefully you write to entertain
Yeah,
yourself. But I think if you really want to stay in this business, if you want to stay in this game, you gotta write what you want to read. You gotta write what pleases you, what tickles your fancy.
it's a very delicate balance, right? Because I mean, you're right. It is a game, but also, and I mean, a lot of video game players will hopefully, gamers will appreciate this analogy. Even though it's fun, there is a discipline to
Yes.
it somewhat.
Hmm.
Uh, like there are some days where where I don't necessarily want to write,
Hmm.
but I'll write anyway because, it's just part of my routine. It's something I
Right.
do.
Right.
And some days nothing comes out, but I've at least outlined
Hmm.
something, or sometimes I'll just spend like a day, revising
Hmm.
something. And it doesn't feel like I've gotten anything done,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, like I actually still have accomplished something.
Yeah, for sure. I think the discipline is absolutely imperative to it. And I just think from the standpoint of coming back to writing, there will always be days where it's the same with like working out, or it's the same of like doing any sort of thing that requires consistency and discipline. There are going to be days. It's the days that you don't want to return, the days you don't want to go back to doing it. Those are the challenge. When inspiration strikes, that's wonderful. Everything seems easy and straightforward. But on the days that, it's like, being a dad, like sometimes my son will not go to sleep until, well after his bedtime, or sometimes he'll wake up in the middle of the night. So I'll be like, oh, I'm going to wake up at 4 a.m. I'm going to, go to my study, going to grab my coffee ready. It's going to be great and pristine. And then suddenly at 2:30 or 1 a.m. he starts crying and he gets sick and all other stuff. And then I realize, oh crap, it's like 4:30 a.m. and like, he's still like, needs to be cared for or whatever. Those days happen. On
Yeah.
another note, you could have like, oh, I'm going to come home from work, I'm going to do this and that, and then something, you get stuck in traffic, or there's an accident on a highway, or you miss your bus. Life happens. It's never going to be perfect, but I think to the point you made earlier about discipline and forcing yourself to do it anyway, that you've accomplished something. I think that's the key. One of the biggest mistakes I've made in the beginning 5 years ago was that if my day wasn't perfect as it was, as I conceived it, right? If I didn't if I said I was going to write for an hour or an hour and a half and I didn't get my hour and a half and I only wrote for 15 minutes, to me at the time it was a failure. Now it's like if I
Yeah.
can just write for 5 minutes, if I can write for like a minute, if I'm in between like meetings or I'm waiting for my coffee at Starbucks or whatever the case may be. Like if I've just got a minute to myself where there's like no disturbance and it's just like, well, I'm on my phone anyway. Let me open Google Docs and just write something there. If I can do that, I've written for the day.
Yeah.
It may have only been for 15 minutes or less, but I wrote today. And then you get into this realization that, you know what? I didn't get my hour, I didn't get my 30 minutes or whatever, but I said to myself, no matter what happens, the words are coming on the page, hell or high water. And I did it. And then your brain will then say to yourself, "Oh, okay, well, he followed through today." The whole world collapsed around him, but he's still got his words on his manuscript. And that's a win. You got to take the small wins. I've learned now that the days will never be perfect as we want them to be. The days, they're the stars will often not align in your favor, but you just gotta push yourself through it and get it done.
Yeah, and no, absolutely. And that's certainly the case for me. Well, Frank, I know you're a busy guy. I know you've got other things to do, so I really appreciate, your time. And I also, I'd love to chat more and, feel free to come back anytime.
Yeah.
What projects are you working on right now? Where can people find you? What's cooking for you just in general, sir?
Yeah, I've got two big projects in the pipeline. One is a anthology series that is written for and will be marketed for young boys between the ages of 8 and 13, or 8 and 12, and it is called the Boys Book of Adventure Stories. And it is a collaborative effort with many great writers in the space, especially those in the men's adventure fiction space. It is a book geared towards boys, specifically in hopes of killing that stupid myth that boys don't read. There is this
Yes.
there is this common myth that boys are just not interested in reading. They play too many video games, yada yada. Yada. I've heard it all, and
Yeah.
it's absolutely horse manure. It's not
Yeah.
true at all.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but like I was saying, yeah, I was actually, I mean, I was told that by a teacher my junior my junior year of high school.
Mhm.
She was, kind of a witch. Like I also had like a great, English teacher my senior year to offset things. So, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of great teachers, but yeah, I mean, I think, you and I both probably, face like the whole myth of, oh, well, boys don't read. And again, I mean, I think that goes back to the whole thing of, I think the reason why boys might not read, at least from my experience, is again, the idea of like, you see like a 500-page novel or like a Game of Thrones that is like, gargantuan. And it's like, well, F this.
Yeah.
I'm never gonna finish that. And I think
Yep.
I think especially guys, when they see books that are like so long and that's all I see
Mhm.
in bookstores,
Yeah.
I think they're like, well, I'm never gonna finish any of these.
Yeah.
So why even bother?
Yeah.
And that was the
That.
mindset that I was trapped in until I really discovered, my grandfather and my uncle's pulp collection and was
Mhm.
like, wow.
Yeah, there's I mean, I think I again to the point, like publishing has kind of everything has shifted more towards a female centric economy in terms of publishing. I mean, romance has always been and always will be the number one genre for publishing. And I'm not knocking
Well, yeah.
it is what it is. But I think for boys, for middle grade boy readers, and there's a great article on Louis L'Amour where someone interviews Louis L'Amour's son, and he in part of the interview, you can find it on Substack. Part of the interview is they want to go find boy readers. They want to market and tailor to boy readers. And it's true. Almost every, with the exception of one, almost every big fan of Louis L'Amour that I know read Louis L'Amour when they were a child, when they were a little boy, around the ages of 8, 9, 10, and 11 years old. And I think getting to that age and finding and producing stories that a young boy, boys, much like, boys and men as readers, one of the things you will find is that boys and men not only desire aspirational characters, they need aspirational characters. They need that Superman, that Batman. They need that Achilles. They need that that character that they want to almost emulate as that hero and root for. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to work on, is making this series of anthologies of short story, a collection of short stories that are geared towards young male readers, in hopes to not only just foster and nurture a love of reading, but to give them something other than that is screen dependent, something else in the marketplace that they can go to for recreation and entertainment purposes, for escapism.
That's kind of my purpose with Blood Ties, and also Shadows of Deception, more specifically, because like I know you're in the Discord, so you you see my things in there all the time, but like I'm a huge James Bond fan.
Yeah,
And
likewise. Yeah.
of course I love the movies, but like when I specifically remember, and this makes me feel old now, but like I remember being a teen, being in my early teens and seeing Casino Royale in theaters. And then I don't even know who gave it to me. I think it might have been my same uncle who gave me Casino Royale, the Ian Fleming novel. And I read that, and I really got into Ian Fleming. And then I started like researching on him, and that, I found out that like, he was the one who, he submitted the short stories to Playboy, and that's how I found out that Playboy actually had a fiction section.
Yep.
And I remember a few years ago, there was a lost interview that someone did with Ian Fleming, where he actually talked about, like, even back in the 1950s, he was, someone mentioned, well, a lot of these adolescent boys are, reading your novels. What do you think? And he said, well, he's like, well, they're not meant for schoolboys, but as far as, teenage adolescents, I think it's, absolutely marvelous that they're, reading my novels. And, I think teenage boys, especially, I think they get bored by dull, that's what he said. But, so now kind of what I'm trying to do is, now that James Bond, kind of his future is up in the air, what I'm doing is trying to kind of fill the void, with my writing. Because I do think that, yes, it is important for young boys to have aspirational, male leaders. But I also think that, teenage boys, and even college students, like myself at one point, also need to be entertained. So that's kind of what I'm working with. So
exactly. And that's what this boys' book of adventure stories will do. We've got about, I believe, 8 or 9 writers as contributors. It's due to be released sometime in mid or late May. We're putting the final touches on everything. We're going to announce by the time this airs, we'll have announced the contributors. But yeah, that's one of my biggest pet projects, and hopefully we'll launch a series of other books, of boys themed books, for that market. And then on the other hand, I've got another book of short stories coming out, much similar to my first one that came out, Grind and Other Strange Stories, which are really just Twilight Zone style cautionary tales set in the humdrum of modernity in contemporary times. I have another book coming out this summer called Numbing Glass, and Other Strange Stories. So those are the two main books that I'm looking to produce. And yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Frank Theodat, and on Substack as well.
Well, Frank, I really appreciate talking to you. And also, like, dude, if you ever want to come on and, promote anything, just let me know. I'd
Yeah.
love to chat with you more. I'd love to, contribute to anything myself if you're interested in having me. And
Oh, for sure.
like I said, I'm not saying this just to, because I'm a fan, but I really do think that you're, an expert on, pulp, and I really appreciate your dedication to, helping people learn more about the pulp genre, and more importantly, the pulp revival. So really appreciate everything, and, I wish you the best of luck. So.
Thank you, Sam. It's been a great conversation. I've had a great time. Would love to come back in the future if you'll have me. So yeah, this has been fun.
Absolutely. Folks, I want to thank you for, tuning in, and I will leave links in the description for all of, Frank's social media, for all his social media and for his Substack. And also, I know, I don't know, Frank, if you're on X at all. I do know that you use Grok, but, I think Twitter is also, useful. But yeah, go and check out Frank on Instagram and Substack. And yeah, you're doing great work, man. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll talk at you down the road.
Thank you.
The right to offend is not some pesky little part of freedom of speech that we have to put up with. It is the heart and soul and lungs of freedom of speech. It is the coursing lifeblood of human progress. It is the instigator of liberty and modernity and science and understanding. What a laughing stock today's student leaders are, that they can so casually dismiss the right to be offensive without realizing that their lovely, enlightened lives are the gift of individuals who gave offense. Offensiveness is not just something we have to begrudgingly accept. Offensiveness is the motor of human progress.
Thank you for watching the Whitfield Report live on the Right to Offend Media Network. Make sure to check out Sam's books on Amazon, Audible, and Kindle. You can follow Sam on X at SamW_NGC and the Right to Offend Media Network at RTO Media. Like, comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. And until next time, God bless, God save this great nation. God, freedom, legacy, in that order.